Hello, my fellow apes and other terrestrials. Welcome to episode 11 of our weekly podcast, We're Talking with Apes. This week, I have a special guest. Lotte, please introduce yourself.
I'm Lotte. I'm ex-film student, which means that I graduated recently. And I'm here to talk a bit about film and politics and leftism, I guess. And I'm also a friend of Tom's and Kane's and Morgan, so that's why I'm here, I guess.
Thank you for coming. You recently wrote your master thesis.
Yes, I did on Straub-Huillet, which is kind of like a niche on subject. So yeah.
Those are two. They're filmmakers. They're a couple. And what should we imagine when thinking of those two?
Of those two, I don't know. It's kind of like a very severe, strict aesthetic that they adhere to, I guess, to like outsiders, but I mean also to insiders. They are very challenging films. They kind of make Marxist cinema with like the purpose of reaching the audience in a very authentic way, which because it like attempts to be so pure in what they're doing, it's kind of like hard to reach a big audience with it, and like it also leads to a lot of frustration with the viewers, of course. But yeah, so that's that, I guess.
And with authentic and pure, how should I imagine that? Because, like you said, they're not the most popular of movies.
I mean, they're very inspired by a kind of like Brechtian aesthetics, but they also like move beyond that. And I guess like some of their films seem like unnecessarily alienating. Like I think if you would describe a Straub-Huillet movie, like a typical Straub-Huillet movie, there's of course like, I guess this is kind of like, how do you say, like heiligschennis, like to
unholy,
to attempt to reduce it to like kind of a formula, but it's also kind of easy to do so. So I mean, let's just say what they typically do is like take some ancient text that seems to have very little to do with communism or modernity, even though that is like kind of like what they're addressing. They want to make anti-capitalist films. So they will take this really old text and then make an adaptation of it, but that is not naturalistic as like a normal adaptation would be, or like, I don't know, like at least an adaptation that we are more used to seeing. And like basically they will use not famous actors, but just like normal working people that then will recite these words in a very seemingly monotonous and kind of like boring, droning way. Also the shots are very static and the movements are very rigid, and it seems all very kind of like robotic in a sense, I guess, for a first-time viewer. So in that way, it is understandable that a lot of people, when the first time they encounter a Straub-Huillet movie, they just have no idea of how to look at it or why it would even be remotely Marxist in a way. So yeah.
And with Asian text, you mean like Antigone or Antigone?
Yeah, Antigone, or like they reference a lot of Greek mythology, but usually through the frame of like other writers, and they also like are very inspired by lots of romantic writing, which actually does, but like also like they reference, like they have all different kinds of sources. They reference people like Kafka. They also reference Brecht. So like more obviously, like, I don't know, modern, or at least like societal, like critical of society. But even like in the older romantic texts, like when they kind of like repurpose it and kind of reveal the kind of critical or the kind of like romantic, anti-capitalistic and anti-modern elements in those texts. So even those in a way kind of relate back to that, I guess.
welcome back to the Marxist stuff, because
Yeah.
we've talked about that a little bit before the podcast. That's one of the big questions here.
Mhm.
But you also mentioned Brecht,
Yes.
which I assume refers to
Bertolt
Bertolt
Brecht.
Brecht. Oh
Yeah.
God,
No,
Uh,
no worries.
the German theater maker, not a
Yeah.
movie maker, right?
No, yeah, theater. Basically his like what we refer to when we're talking about Brechtian influences on film, it's usually like his form of epic theater, which is kind of a radical political leftist theater that was kind of a reaction to classical notions of theater. And basically what they're going against is kind of this idea that a play should kind of like cause some form of catharsis in the viewer. And catharsis, like, I guess most people know this term, but like when we talk about it in theater studies, like it originated from all the way back from Aristotle's Poetics. And the meaning of the word is kind of like a purification, like the literal meaning. So when we talk about catharsis, it's like a purification of emotions. So in Aristotle's view of the theater, we go to the theater to kind of feel with the protagonist and feel with the story to kind of like, I guess, purify our excess emotion in order to be better citizens in real life. So it's kind of like when you watch Titanic and it's really sad and you cry and then you feel kind of relieved afterwards, probably because you had some tensions and you kind of like had to let the emotions go. So that's like catharsis. And Brecht wanted to go against that because like if we are purely watching purely spectating a story or like with our emotion and purely seeing it from that point of view, there's like it's not really making us think about like societal structures or like not really leading us to class consciousness. So for example, like a protagonist in a story can like lose all of their belongings and like die in poverty, and our only reaction will be like, oh, that's like really sad, like, oh my god, it's such a sad story, but we're not really questioning like why that's happening or maybe how that could be prevented. So it's just merely a story, I guess. And then
I have to admit, when watching Harry Potter, I was also like, oh, he has to live under the stairs. I wasn't questioning society. Yes.
No, yeah, and like that's the thing, like of course that is a big element in art, and I'm not like, I don't know enough of Brecht to think that he wanted to get rid of all of that, like say like, no, it's illegitimate. But like what he did want to do what he did want to do was in order to make political art, we kind of have to move beyond that. And a big misconception about epic theater is that it is the enemy of this kind of catharsis, or this kind of like, okay, it's the enemy of catharsis probably, but but this enemy of all emotion, because like what epic theater is most known for is the alienation effect.
Yeah, that's a term that gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah, so like basically it's kind of like when you watch something, it constantly tries to remind you that it is a story that is trying to tell you something, and it is trying to, I guess, teach you something about the world or like make you think critically. But the big misconception about that is that like Brechtian theater is only alienation. And I think a good quote by a writer, I guess his name was Gilberto Perez, like that I encountered in my research, was that like there is basically no use of distancing people when nothing is drawing them in. So we would be kind of like, oh, hey, this is a story, and don't forget that this is a story, and nothing here is real. And like, then you can ask yourself, so okay, so but why should I care then? Why should I keep watching? So the idea is kind of like that there is emotion in there and there is some feeling, but you're constantly kind of like, it's kind of a balancing of it and also giving it some edge. He does that by, you know, providing you a story, but then also sometimes putting like real facts out there or putting elements there that don't completely fit in the story. And another big misconception is that like Brechtian acting is kind of this ironic wink wink acting, like, oh, but don't forget, I'm just a character. Like, it's not that. Like, but that was also my misconception. Like, I was taught about Brechtian theater in high school and also in my first bachelor year, and that was for a long time what I just thought Brechtian acting was just like, I don't know, either very dry,
looking straight at the audience, and
kind of
hey
that. And basically, it's not that. Like in like there are recordings of like Mutter Courage, which is one of his plays, and that's from the 50s, which was still like under his direction, so we can kind of see like how the actors were supposed to act in his artistic vision, and then you can see that the characters do like play their parts sincerely, but it is with a distance. Like, they just play the part. Like, I think I wrote it down here in my notes, so I can, like, I thought it was a good way to explain it. So basically, a big word is also that they're not playing the words as if they would say them themselves. They're playing the words as if they would cite them, as if they would quote them. So they're not their words. They are citing them because they're referring to something else. It does not aim at making us forget that there's an actor playing this part, which is most usually what happens with stories that do want to draw you in and do aim at that kind of a catharsis.
Try to give you the idea that this is all realistic, this is all exactly.
It's these kind of ideas of like, oh, they really lost themselves in the part, and kind of this method acting, like forgetting what reality and illusion is. Like, it's kind of trying to really keep that balance. And so a Brechtian actor is basically constantly reminding you that, you know, I am making this specific jest for a reason, or I am saying these words like this for a reason, like, and that reason is basically like making you think, I guess. So yeah.
And because the citing is the thing you also mentioned in the movies of Straub and Huillet. Yeah. I'm not sure if I pronounce it. Huillet.
Yeah.
Yes.
Straub, so yeah, I also forgot, like, so it's like Jean-Marie Straub and Danièle Huillet, which is like, Danièle Huillet is French, and Straub is also French, but I think he was from Alsace, which was like, he was like raised to learn German and stuff, so like with the war. And yeah, I guess they met each other in the 60s and then just made movies together. And I don't know, we're always very militant, made movies in Italy and France and Germany. I think they were even banned from France for a very long while because, like, I think Jean-Marie Straub had to join the army, the French army, and then he refused to. So I don't know. I think there's also something
in the
there.
articles you sent me. I read something with the war in Algeria. Yeah, because he would be drafted. Yeah, and he refused to. Yes. Yeah. So yeah, always been very militant, very kind of like, So. But the citing, yes. So that, like, I think if we talk about the Brechtian elements in Straub-Huillet, it's definitely that, like, kind of citing of the words. We need to be very aware of the materiality of the words, basically. So if they're adapting this ancient text, they will not attempt to make the text seem more natural if it would be performed, which is usually what kind of like a Hollywood adaptation would do, for example. And so they don't really want to do that. They want to, like, kind of leave that friction in there. So what they'll often do is kind of like, if there's punctuation or stuff like that, they will like really emphasize that and really like keep that in there and like rehearse the text with their actors and like kind of almost make it more musical, rhythmic in a way. As if you would recite a poem, like old ancient, like, I don't know how to say, like a scandere, like it's kind of like that. So I don't know Italian, but there's like one, like the first movie that I watched of them was Dalla Nube alla Resistenza. And then there a text of a modern author is adapted, like a modern Italian author, but they are adaptations of Greek mythology. And that was like prose, it was prose. Or no, it wasn't. The second half of it the second half of it was prose and the first half of it was poetry. Okay. But so the first half was meant to kind of be read aloud
or could be. The second hand wasn't, but this kind of like scansion. I don't know how to say it in English. So this kind of diction reciting, it's kind of throughout all the movie. And so basically the characters will just speak like this the entire time. It's like da 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 da. So it's kind of like and that makes it like, of course, very hard to watch, because I don't know, as a modern audience, are also just not used to that anymore. I don't know.
One of their, I mean, looking at the critics, especially the one that really doesn't like their movies. This point out that at some point the non-professional performers stand in the woods and read monologues for 2 hours. That's in Workers Peasants.
I mean, yeah, he's not wrong. That's exactly it.
That's some pretty heavy stuff.
It is pretty heavy stuff. Yeah, and that's also what's kind of frustrating about it, because the course that we had to watch it in, and where I was first introduced to these filmmakers, was Aesthetics of Contemporary Cinema. And so basically all the things we saw were like slow, boring, difficult. I mean, I say boring, but like I'm not supposed you
have your degree, you can say whatever you want.
No, I have found some interesting things in that, but I do understand that like the majority of people would find it boring, and also I would find it boring at first, but then but even this, like Straub-Huillet, is like a few tiers like above that even, like, so there is kind of like the difficult movies, and then there's this, like, because with the other ones you can still kind of like, I don't know, get used to the rhythm of it, and then kind of like, I don't know, maybe find some aesthetic pleasure in it, or find something interesting about it. And with this one, I guess the difficulty is that because people are speaking the entire time, you kind of have the feeling that you're constantly missing things, or you're just like too stupid to understand it, or like too ignorant of the context. And that makes you feel like it's constantly going over your head. So you can't really like even kind of lose yourself in it, or be like, oh, but this is a very nice shot, or this is interesting, because you're constantly feeling like you're missing things. And what's interesting was that then I found in an interview that is basically kind of the whole purpose, because like basically what like I think what Huillet once said in, like, it was like a Q&A after a watching, and then I think the audience was addressing that it was frustrating that there were no subtitles, because that's also something that they're super strict about. Like, there will be sometimes subtitles, but then they will be subtitles that Danièle Huillet like wrote herself, and also again in a very strict way, where it's like, not like if you would translate from French to German, she wouldn't try to make it sound more natural in German. Like, again, it's trying to find that friction. So if you would have like an idiom in French, I guess she wouldn't try to find the equivalent idiom in German. It would be like, I don't know, a very literal translation, in as far as you can do that. And then sometimes she would even like purposefully like leave the subtitles out. So you're like watching it with subtitles, and then all of a sudden there's no subtitles anymore. And you're like, what?
Like trolling people.
Yeah, kind of. But it's kind of like to remind you that there's like a whole movie going out there, and you're like, you reading the subtitles and trying to grasp desperately like everything that's being said is kind of like defeating the purpose. Like, because she's also like, it's kind of a comment on how we cannot really possess this kind of, like, we have this idea that we can possess this knowledge and like can completely understand it and make it our own. But it's like she said, like, it's the same as with reading. When you're reading a book, you're also not like taking in every word and like constantly kind of like, you're also kind of reading it in a stream and kind of losing all this detail. And that's, I guess, kind of what you're pointing at.
Yeah, one review said, generally their work is intended to be viewed in concert with other forms of knowledge, with a mastery of several European languages, with an authoritative understanding of the complex politics of rearmament, rearmament.
Okay, I don't even know that
post-war
word.
Federal Republic of Germany with a familiarity with now obscure text from antiquity, etc.
Yeah, and I mean that's like pretty funny because that's like completely against their purpose. And that's also the thing I guess that is the biggest I don't know, point of tension or point of discussion, is that their whole thing is that their movies are meant for the proletariat, for the working class, and that like they completely go against this idea that you should have any knowledge beforehand, or that like you should even have this knowledge of language. Like they kind of want to respect these boundaries of language. Like if you don't know Italian and you want to watch this movie, it's like, okay, but like you're not going to understand the Italian and you should just be at peace with that. And like, I don't know, look at the other elements of the movie, I guess. I guess it's because they're kind of like, oh, we accept the boundaries that are put on us by class, but we do not accept the boundaries that are put on us by language, which is kind of weird because then it's kind of like, oh, so you're against the accessibility of your films. But
because that sounds like the biggest difference where Brecht really tried to reach, or at least had the idea of reaching a broad audience.
Yeah. But they also kind of want to do that, but then again, they also don't want to compromise on, because they kind of feel like that would be condescending.
Yes.
Like there was one text where they're talking about how it's very difficult for them to distribute their films. And for example, there was like an Italian TV station, and they would only show their films if they were dubbed, which is something that like was a big no.
Yeah, I can
like,
imagine
don't dub them.
if you like playing with the subtitles even.
Because they kind of have this feeling like it's just so, and that's maybe something we can also return back to, but like the specific detail of the moment when it is being filmed, and like even the sound or the timbre of their actors' voices is actually so important to them. It's basically like, it's like the soul of these people, and you can't just like dub over it. Like that would like just be completely, I don't know. So yeah, it kind of has to do with that. And so like they were kind of arguing against that. And then also these movies were only being shown at like, I don't know, 1 in the morning or 2 in the morning. And then it's like, oh,
very accessible.
Yeah, we're completely not reaching a worker or like a proletariat audience with that then. So like, yeah, they were constantly struggling with this. So kind of the sad thing about it is that they were very much against academic intellectualism and against like the structure of academia.
Like they've become an extreme example of academic.
Yeah, but that was not really their, or like that was really not their intention. Like they're super critical of that. They're super critical of film festivals and of kind of this idea of like cultural capital of like, oh, I understand this super niche like leftist content and that makes me I don't know, like a better human. Like no, they're like super rigid against that. But now those are the only people watching their movies, like myself included. Like I guess they would probably hate me for writing this thesis, you know? So yeah.
Speaking about your thesis, before we jump into the big Marxist debate, maybe you also mentioned that in your abstract that some people suggested that there was a move from Brecht to Benjamin.
Yeah.
Who is Benjamin? I don't know Benjamin yet.
Yeah, it's Walter Benjamin. And he was actually a good friend of Brecht. Like Brecht is so, like to contextualize Brecht, he was a playwright from like around the 30s, 40s, 50s from Berlin. So they really like kind of like lived through that like pre-war, like the, how do you say, the years leading up to the Second World War in Germany.
The interbellum.
The interbellum, yeah. And Walter Benjamin is also from Berlin during that time, also another philosopher. Actually, his story is like really tragic, but like he was Jewish, and he so then also had to flee the country to avoid persecution. And he was able to flee all the way to the coast of France, where he would be able to like flee the continent by boat. But then I guess just on the night before, like the Nazis got up on him and he then committed suicide in order to like get away from that situation. So actually, it's like a very tragic story. And in his philosophy, like he was also a Marxist thinker, and he's often connected to like the Frankfurter Schule, Frankfurt School of like Theodor Adorno and like other thinkers, critical thinkers. So critical in that they're critical of modernity. So in a lot of his philosophy, it's also basically trying to challenge fascism and trying to find a way to battle against it, basically.
And so when Brecht is the one that brings this constant reminder that you're kind of watching a play, or that this effect of alienation and catharsis, what should we what should we imagine when...
I think maybe the difference, like if there's a difference, because they've also influenced each other in many ways, and Brecht is also not just one thing, but I think what Brecht kind of represents, like another big element of his theater, is that there's a fable that kind of overarches the plot.
Yeah,
so
like a little lesson, or...
No, yeah, but fable as in kind of the explanation of why these events are taking place, and that explanation would be then, like, for example, because capitalism is bad, like you know, or and because we are in need of a Marxist revolution, like that's basically the fable. So everything in that happens in the story, even the smallest element, relates back to that bigger fable. And so the biggest criticism of Brecht, I guess after the World War, kind of with like post-war cynicism and kind of like with, I mean, I have to watch out with postmodern thinking, because I don't know if it's like, I would say it relates back to this idea of like the end of grand narratives, of like the narrative of modernity, the narrative of progress, and like or of the Enlightenment.
Can shape everything.
Yeah,
like rational beings that. Yeah,
we're or like religion, like we're kind of starting to lose our faith in that. And Marxism is one of those grand narratives.
Yes. So
if we have to look at a Brecht play and then like every little thing is explained from the perspective of this idea of the dissolution of capitalism is inherent of the progress of capitalism, and then after that will be communism, like that is just not something
doesn't work anymore.
And so like what is the value of that then still? So then you will have like post-Brechtian theater makers who will kind of still use elements of Brecht, like they will still make plays and say these are socially significant, but we cannot pretend that knowing the exact meaning of every single thing that we put here, this kind of didactic idea of like, we as theater makers are the teachers. We know what the world looks like because we're this kind of intellectual class that like knows these things from analysis and stuff like that. And we're going to teach a worker audience. Like they have kind of lost faith that they can fulfill that position. And so they do not claim at knowing that anymore. So they will like make these performances and kind of also transfer that responsibility of making sense of it also on the audience. They're like, we cannot pretend that knowing everything, you will also have to come up with your own answers to this, like kind of deferring
and
that.
And that's more Benjamin's influence then, or?
Yeah, it is more Benjaminian, because of, like maybe now I should like kind of move on first to like the two most important texts that I also refer to in my thesis by Benjamin, which are the film essay, the long title, which is, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. That's the full name. And you can call it like I refer to it as film essay, but it's also just as well the aura essay. Basically, it's the idea that art used to have this kind of aura around this aura of authority or this aura of legitimacy, like this idea of like, well, the Mona Lisa is like a masterpiece, and it's like, why? Just because, like, if you look at it, it's like you just know, and it's like, but why though? And kind of Benjamin kind of makes a material analysis of that. Like the only reason for that basically is kind of that a work of art used to be unique. Like if you make a painting, like that's an object that someone made, and it has like a fixed place in time, and you know, it has like its own germany, so it has its authenticity, and that authenticity determines its value. So like at least with the Mona Lisa you can be like, yeah, but it's like the genuine thing. So but because of mechanical reproduction, which was coming up during his time because of photography and printing and stuff like that, and film, you could like reproduce it. So he was kind of like, so what is the difference then between like the Mona Lisa and a copy of the Mona Lisa? Like you cannot tell the difference anymore. And the idea is kind of like, what I'm also maybe skipping over is that like this kind of ritual value of it is basically that you have to go to a specific place in order to see it.
Yeah,
and
there's
like
only one of it. You have to go there.
Yeah.
You have to.
And like with museums, that became a little bit more accessible. But like in the past, the art was only like for the aristocracy, and it was hanging in their homes and nobody else could see it. Or it was hanging in a church, but then it also had a different ritual value to it. Like this kind of transcendent idea behind it. So with museums, it became a little bit more accessible, but then it also became a little bit more warped. So, okay, why are these works of art still valuable? And I think John Berger has like a good analysis of that. And like he has a very interesting documentary series, Ways of Seeing, which I would recommend to a lot of people.
Ways of Seeing.
Ways of Seeing.
Okay.
And in the first episode, which was inspired by Walter Benjamin's essay, he kind of talks about how art criticism tries to kind of maintain this aura around the work of art, like kind of trying to legitimize why it's supposed to be so much more important than every other thing, and why it's supposed to be like then like trying to legitimize why it's worth so much money. Like that's basically what we're talking about. So what Benjamin is actually talking about is just plain old commodity fetishism.
Okay.
And so he says that because of photography, because of film, like that directly challenges aura. He, like, in some of his versions, he sees it as a negative thing, but that's a whole other thing. In this version, like
I'm
the
sure there's a lot of people discussing that one.
Yeah.
But
in this particular version, the most well-known version, he tries to kind of spin it in a positive way, because that also means we're kind of liberated from the oppression of this tradition of art and of other traditions, of this kind of myths that are hanging over us. So again, the end of grand narratives, like this idea that like we have to live our lives according to what religion says we have, you know. So he says it's also good in a way, because that means we can look at the world anew and make our own sense of it. And then he sees...
You don't all have to comply with the idea that this is how you should make a painting, this is how you should make a movie even.
Yes. And he is kind of then looking like, okay, maybe this means we can move more into the experiment, like make many different kind of things, but like don't, like that are not necessarily the one best thing, you know? And he sees that experimentation kind of in film, like he sees in film a big potential for that. So because like at the time there was also the Soviet cinema of like Eisenstein and Dziga Vertov, and especially Dziga Vertov. He had this movie like Man with a Moving Camera, which is basically a portrait of the city, and it's just such a refreshing kind of like radical new way of looking at the world. And he sees that also inherent in like the camera eye itself. Like basically he compares the camera to dynamite that blows up the street, but then it helps us to like then go explore around like the ruins and find like new interesting ways of looking at it. I don't know. So yeah, that's a film essay. And then there's another essay, which is the history essay, which is a thesis on the philosophy of history, in which he kind of argues that like Marxism needs theology and theology needs Marxism in order to reach redemption or revolution. And theology in the sense of messianism Benjamin was very influenced by Jewish mysticism. And like, if we think about them, like from a Christian point of view, we think of like Jesus Christ, but in Jewish mysticism and like Jewish thinking, the Messiah hasn't arrived yet. The Messiah is still to come. And Benjamin is not talking about some holy figure that will come down to earth and will, free us all. Or he's not talking about some kind of Übermensch in a way or something. Like what he's talking about is a weak messianic power that is in all of us. Okay. Like all of us have the potential of kind of working at liberating ourselves.
Sounds Marxist, yeah.
It's very Marxist. So it's not magical in any way. It's basically just that, like, I think what he's pointing is that we do have agency, but we have to utilize it. And what he's challenging is kind of this myth of progress that, like, is so typical of capitalism, that everything is constantly improving for the better. And that also then some Marxisms also started to believe in, or some, like, he was very critical of, like, I think the Socialist Democratic Party in Berlin, because they were so complacent in this idea of like, oh, but like with technological innovation, everything is changing for the better and the people will be less oppressed because of that.
Not like we've heard that argument any days, right? And in recent times.
Yeah.
But we kind of smoothed into the topic of Marxism.
Yeah.
Because Straub-Huillet.
Huillet.
God damn it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you sent me one very angry, I think I can call it angry article of a guy that was like, this is not actually Marxism. Maybe because he does acknowledge that you do see the experiences of and the views and the ideas of people that have lived or experienced the horror of Nazism, imperialism with the Algerian war, for example, and the continuous threat of militaristic, fascistic catastrophe presented by the, and I'm quoting here, existence of global capitalism. But he doesn't consider them genuine Marxist. First of all, when would a movie be genuine Marxist? I know that's a very big question, which is probably fully debated, but like what things could we expect to see or
that's the thing. I'm not enough of an expert on Marxism to kind of make this claim, but it's also this kind of false idea that there's one true Marxism. I think what he's also like, but I think what's very apparent in the article, especially at the end, his conclusion is like, these are not real Marxists. And then he compares them to other people that he doesn't consider real Marxists, but are very much Marxists. Like he talks about the like Frankfurter Schule and Adorno and like people like that. And then I think like, oh, this is specifically that faction of Marxism that I'm talking about, like Benjamin's Marxism, like maybe, I don't know, romantic Marxism. And maybe it's just a Marxism that people are also less aware of. So yeah, to like come back very quickly to the history essay, just to explain this. So like he says, like Marxism or dialectical materialism needs theology, so Messianism, and Messianism needs dialectical materialism. What he means with that is basically that we are like, because of this myth of progress and because technical innovation is happening so rapidly, we're kind of moving in the bad direction. Like he's very pessimistic of what's going to be at the end of that. Like he has no trust that that's going to lead us anywhere good. And he argues that we have to actively like go against the tide of this like so-called progress. And in order to do that, we have to make use of our weak messianic power. And we kind of have to look at like details and like potentialities that we're kind of maybe overlooking now because we see them as naive, or we see them as like having no use to us, he talks basically about like hidden histories of the oppressed.
Yeah.
Because like he says that like our main history that we teach in schools and that we know and identify ourselves by is the history of the victors, is the history of the people who have always won in history.
Yeah, one of the big issues of especially Western history at the moment.
So he says there's like no artifact, no cultural artifact that like we now revere that isn't a result of barbarity, isn't a result of like oppressing other people. And so basically what he's also saying is that because of that, the things that, or the values that we hold high, like maybe there's also different values that like were important in the past and we now just like don't really look at them or don't really consider them useful to us because we're not able to see them anew anymore. And he basically argues that we have to look for these hidden histories of the oppressed to maybe find the slightest chance of like changing this course of history. And he sees that chance as being very, very, very slim, but not non-existent. So he argues for a very radical pessimism, a very active pessimism, like something that should like, I don't know, like move you into action. So that's kind of like those two things combined. Like there is a possibility of redemption, but that possibility is very, very slim and it is determined by our material conditions. But maybe we have to look at those material conditions with more attention and search for like different possibilities of like changing stuff, you know?
Yeah. Because the most interesting part of the criticism that I found, the article was written by David Walsh, by the way. The most interesting part I found was that he says they're not actually an alternative at all to the current system we live in. He says they are the other side of the same coin, where the one is this... mindlessness of commercial cinema. What they have is a complete divorce of a variety of leftism from life. Like the one is commercial bullshit, if I can translate freely.
Yes.
And what they have is just unrealistic bullshit. Like
Yes.
it's still both bullshit, is what he says.
Yes.
And it speaks to a period of political and cultural stagnation in which we live. So because they are extremely... they ended up being very academic or being watched
or like
by the
maybe excessively negative or like rejecting of life. Like I interpreted the thing of like divorced from life as like a criticism that returns very often in certain kinds of leftist art, that it like, I don't know, it really wants to try to escape this dominant view of looking at things. That like it seems at some point to have nothing to do with us anymore. But I think the interesting thing about that, which is what I'm also arguing in my thesis, is that it's not divorced from life. Actually, it has this very high commitment to life, but it's just, I don't know, again, in this idea of this very slim chance that we might observe out there somewhere. They kind of believe that real humanity is kind of something that is lost to us right now, and we wouldn't really recognize it now. So like, I think, sorry, it's difficult to explain. So I think basically the reason why Walsh is saying this is because like the actors playing their part, they're playing their part so dryly and so without emotion, and like any emotion or like any recognizable emotion is the enemy. And it is true in as far as they try to avoid naturalistic depictions of emotion. But I compare basically their acting style to kind of the acting that can be found in Bresson. And Bresson was a Protestant like filmmaker who like has been categorized as like transcendental cinema. I forgot the guy who came up with the name, but so basically his actors did a very specific thing, which is basically acting as models. And so that meant that, I don't know, they played their texts like almost in a kind of meditative state, like very much like not trying to add anything to it. Like it's just like they say the words and that's
No
it.
facial expression or body
No
language.
facial expression, no body language, no intentional facial expression or
Okay.
body language. So the emotion that had to arise then, or like the slightest sliver of it, had to be their own or had to be like authentic emotion. And I think Bresson kind of had this idea of like, if you look into their eyes, you can see their soul, like kind of like that. Like, and so there's no affectation that it's kind of distracting from that. And I kind of also recognize that in Straub-Huillet, that like, because the way they recite their text, it's like so strict, but it also feels like kind of like as you would do like yoga, or you would say a mantra, or you would like do meditation, you kind of get into this state where you're not thinking with your rational brain, but you're kind of like more acting through your like bodily habits, and they see that as more genuine to us than like
to
this kind of
immerse
fake,
in the role and,
like
and
fake
create the
emotion,
emotion.
like method acting kind of idea of like faking emotion. And the same with like the story, like they, like I think Walsh also says that like they are like they are against any natural fascination with drama that like humans have. So I guess basically that's like the criticism of like or maybe I'm strawmanning here, but I do think he's kind of like, oh, but what is wrong with catharsis? What is wrong with classical storytelling?
Yeah, he's quoting Trotsky at some point, or at least referring to Trotsky. He's saying it would inevitably require, real Marxist cinema, I guess, as Leon Trotsky suggested, a definite and important feeling for the world, a feeling for life as it is, an artistic acceptance of reality and not a shrinking from it, an active interest in the concrete stability and mobility of life, a preoccupation with our life of three dimensions as a sufficient and invaluable theme for art. So basically, like it sounds a little bit like the gritty realism, like the romantic paintings depicting workers in the field and workers in the factory almost.
But I do think that like Straub-Huillet, I want to stay away from that because like, isn't that also a fantasy in a way? Isn't that also in a way something that we try? Like I
it's
think
an idealized.
I think Lenin was also quoted in the Gilberto Perez text, and it's kind of also a flattery of the revolutionary people, I guess, to kind of the self-mythologizing of like, oh, the true gritty reality, like the salt of the earth kind of idea, and like also a big thing that I wanted to say is like, it's not that it's unrecognizable to us that these things have nothing to do with life anymore. Like the texts that Straub-Huillet choose are texts that resonated very deeply and personally with them. And also if you look at some of the words, like for example, they use this text by Hölderlin, who was a early German romantic poet and translator. And he translated this story, also Greek mythological, about Der Totes Empedocles. That was one. And in the text, they talk about a kind of utopia. And Straub-Huillet, like it's from interviews and stuff like that, you can see how the way he describes this utopia with like so much emotion and with so much passion, like that really resonated with them, and like that really felt real to them, and as something that they wanted to use in their films and like show to other people as truthfully as they could. And so then to say like, oh, it has nothing to do with life, it has nothing to do with real emotion, like no, it does, but specifically what they hold valuable to them, and in that way they are authentic. And just, but I do understand if you would see it from the old for the first time, it would be like, oh, it's this very old text that has nothing to do with this anymore, recited in a very dry way, and it seems like it has nothing to do with life anymore. But everything, every little action is done very purposefully. I don't know. And so this idea of like, oh, if it would be truly emotional, if it would be truly true to people, it should be about this. It's like, no, it's also again your notion of what it should be about, and it's again another fantasy, I guess, or another myth. So
the this is the most, as you said again, this is very high on that shelf of like trying to kind of kick the or trying to alienate people and trying to get out of anything that feels immersive or realistic in that sense. But I was looking through this is a bit away from Straub and Huillet.
Yeah.
God damn it.
No, it's good. Like just
that name. But I was looking through the other films that are sometimes considered Marxist, or that at least by a guy that wrote the entire guide by Fairfax.
Fairfax, yeah.
Are considered Marxist, or that you should watch in the various Marxist periods. And it contains a few interesting titles, which I don't think are often considered to be Marxist movies. And it has Nosferatu, the vampire, Nosferatu, from 1921, La Dolce Vita from 1960. It has Citizen Kane from 1941 by Orson Welles, and it has also Fahrenheit 9/11 by Michael Moore on it.
Yeah.
For the contemporary ones. But yeah, that's not something you would immediately clock as.
No, I think that also speaks to the diversity of like how you can think about Marxist ideas in film. Like I think it's also this idea of like, I don't know, that maybe a lot of Marxist tendencies are inherent in some films, even if it wasn't maybe the intention of the maker or like what they were very preoccupied with. The Citizen Kane is actually a good example of that. Like the recent, like I talked, but I'll refer back to that because it might be interesting. Citizen Kane was written by this guy named Mank, and recently there was there was a biopic made about this story with Gary Oldman, and basically he was like a very leftist, like progressive guy who wanted to make this very critical screenplay about the American dream and like how that can like turn sour and like how, you know, the kind of problem with that, and try to really kind of fight against these Hollywood execs to kind of like put this story out there. And there's recently been made a movie about it. So like even a movie like Citizen Kane that like we now only look back to as in like, oh, it's like so important for, I don't know, it's technological innovation, but we completely don't recognize it as a radical story anymore. Which it might have been at the time, you know. Like
if I'm not mistaken, it's on a list of movies that were culturally significant for the development of the USA.
It's usually what everybody cites, and
one of their.
And I think that's also interesting because I think it also has to do with a lot of romantic notions. Like I haven't talked a lot about romantic, like there's so many things you can talk about. But what's also really interesting is
Morgan will definitely drag you back on the podcast at some point.
I mean, yeah, like I really hope I am making sense because like it's a big subject and it's really hard to explain to people. But like romanticism, like there was also a book that I read, like, so there's like the Marxist influences, but then there's also the romantic influences. And I read this book that basically argues that like what all romanticisms have in common is that they're always a criticism of modernity. They always go against modernity. And with that, like often also against capitalism. And so shit, what was I gonna say? Wait. No, I had a point.
Let me.
Oh yeah. So
okay.
And so often with romantic, it's kind of like this nostalgia of like past values that were once important and like that we kind of lost, like community and stuff like that. So in one of the later chapters of the book, he also talks about how there's also a lot of romantic notions in like very mainstream Hollywood films, and that are kind of inherently subversive, like if you really think them through, but then are kind of like tempered, because like it's again with the aim of this kind of catharsis. So it will make use of these romantic notions, like I don't know, what's a good example? I think basically what it's arguing is that like the values of capitalism, like I guess self-sufficiency, of being self-made, of being very individualistic, those are important to us, but like there is still a very big need for these older values that are kind of like that go against what capitalism represents, this idea, this need for community, of sense of belonging and stuff like that. And because of that, it's like very attractive, and they're often used in like commercials or mainstream cinema to kind of like fill that need for
and
those
have
things.
You alleviate those emotional needs and then
but strip them of their subversive qualities. And so, for example, like a good example that they're talking about is like the Neverending Story, that originally the book, The Neverending Story, was actually meant to be very subversive and kind of like go against, like the author himself is actually very critical of capitalism and stuff like that. But then it got turned into this super like popular 80s blockbuster that like everybody has nostalgia to, and it's still like very important to people, but nobody will remember it as like a story that is like
for its
critical or
nature.
subversive, you know, like, so it's like stuff like that. It's like tempered, which often happens with like countercultural subversive movements. I forgot the exact term for it, but it has a name, this process. Like.
Let me ask you this as a last question, so maybe to close. Should we, with activists or with people that are, you know, should we get the Marxists together and sit and watch the Straub-Huillet movie, or is that a thing we should do? Just maybe once or something, or is it?
I think definitely once. But that's the thing. They think their movie should be able to be watched without context, and like if the people are gonna get it, they're gonna get it. like what they often say is like,
I feel like a lot of people will walk out on that event.
Yeah, like what they often say is like, yeah, we don't have a big audience, or like people don't get our movies yet, but that's because the audience of that will like our movies doesn't exist yet, which sounds like a cop-out.
It sounds very pretentious.
Yeah, and it is very, no, like, it cannot be argued against that, like, it is definitely pretentious, but what they also kind of mean with that is that, like, it is difficult to imagine because we aren't liberated yet and stuff like that. So there is some legitimacy behind what they're saying, but it also sounds very funny. It's like what every unsuccessful filmmaker could say.
They don't understand.
The audience hasn't been invented yet. It's not even their fault. It's just that they're not ready, or like maybe the next generation.
That makes it a little bit better that they're not saying we're stupid.
Yeah. So what they're saying is basically like, no, like if they're gonna get, like they'll just get it. So I do think that if you would show it to people, I think like I do think we should like come together and like try to watch it, and then also like maybe after that definitely encourage discussion, or like I don't know, but I do think I feel kind of conflicted about it, because like as we say, they haven't proven very successful, I guess, in their mission of reaching the working class. But that doesn't mean that like we aren't in need of some challenge, you know, and to kind of like stick with the kind of thing that we are familiar with. And I do think their formal experiments are very radical, and they do lead to lots of interesting discussions. So yeah, no, definitely we should come together, but then maybe also give like maybe a little bit of background info. I don't know, like try to contextualize it a
without context.
Yeah, like no subtitles, just Italian poetry the entire time, and you know, like just feel the Marxism. Like
feel the Marxism.
Like let it come to you.
I feel like that's a beautiful that's a beautiful quote. Maybe we'll use that as a title. Feel the Marxism.
Yeah.
Because as a last comment, they haven't been really successful, if I may say that.
I mean, in as far as they wanted to not reach an intellectual audience of cinephiles and academics and intellectuals, yeah, they definitely failed in their mission. But I mean, as they say, their movies are kind of meant to last. And I don't know, they just wanted to put something very pure and something that they fully stood behind. And if like it's not going to reach anybody, then so be it. But maybe it might reach somebody, and even maybe it could like lead to that person being like, oh, I kind of get what they were going for, but I don't know, I'm going to do something like that, but maybe better. Like even that would kind of, I guess, be
maybe
succeeding, you know, like in their view, because then it at least would have led someone to do something. Like I think
maybe we should experiment with their movies a little bit and see
maybe.
What parts of them stick and what reactions they cause.
I think that's also a big thing with them not wanting to be a didactic. Like it's not them making these movies and saying like, oh, this is what the revolution is going to be like. It's definitely meant for people to not become more passive, but activate them into doing something. And if that something is making a completely different movie that like is better in their view, then at least that has moved them to do something, you know?
Okay.
Like, I don't know. So, yeah. And we should experiment with it, definitely.
Okay. Thank you, Lotte.
Yeah, you're welcome.
We'll definitely have you on again.
Okay.
Movies are too important not to talk about.
Yeah, no, definitely. Maybe next time about a less broad and vast subject, but yeah.
But it was interesting. We don't get to talk about more niche films a lot.
That's true. And we should at least give them a chance, maybe.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay.
Thank you guys for listening, and we'll get back to you by next week probably. Bye-bye.
Bye.